I'm going to make recordings for each section of the lecture notes in terms of what you can expect on the final exam. So just a couple of notes about the final exam before we jump into this. Right, it's on Thursday, and you can bring three 3x5 note cards. As usual, I tend to write longer tests, so you're not necessarily going to have the ability to look up everything on your note card. There'll be conceptual questions you can't just find on your note card. So you can decide what you want to put on them. I don't think you need 3 of them, but you might want to have a couple. So let's talk about what's going to be on the exam. We'll start with part 1. So for part 1 of the lecture notes, this was mostly our definition heavy section, and you can plan to see quite a bit of this because those definitions we continue to use in all the rest of the parts, right? So one of the first definitions we saw was statistic versus parameter, right? Which were our measurements from either our sample or our population. So you pretty much can guarantee you see a question about this. We should be really good at it, especially after coming out of part 7 where we had to tell our sample standard deviation and our population standard deviation apart. So we've had a lot of practice with statistic versus parameter throughout the semester. This question, just if you wanted to look through the old tests, couple of ways I ask it. One is I just give you a blurb and I ask what is the statistic, and you have to identify that, or what is our population of interest. I can also give you a blurb and then say which of the following is this value of 54. Is it a statistic or a parameter? Those tend to be the only ways. So either I'm going to have to give you a blurb, and you're going to have to define what is the sample, what is the population, what is the statistic, what is the parameter. Stuff we've all done before. So that was our first topic. The next thing we talked about was our sampling methods, and definitely still fair game for the final. And remember, we had the big 4 that we discussed: our simple random sample, stratified and cluster, and systematic. Stratified and cluster were the 2 that we had the most trouble keeping track of when we talked about this before. Stratified was when we took a sample from a bunch of different groups. We got all the groups so we could make sure our sample was representative of our population. And cluster was where we took entire groups. So it was a little bit easier in terms of a sampling method. We sampled the groups themselves as opposed to individuals. But the groups had to be mixed up, otherwise we could end up with some issues there. So those were the 2 that we had some trouble telling apart. Also from part 1, we talked about bias, right? Our different types of sampling bias. We had response bias, non-response bias, and undercoverage were some that we talked about. We talked about a lot more. As I talked about on that for the first exam, similar here, I'm not going to necessarily give you these and then ask you which. I'll probably just give you a scenario and have you, as a short answer, tell me what's wrong with this sample. Why doesn't it accurately represent the population? And I'm not necessarily looking for you to use these terms as much as I am for you to just use critical thinking to say, oh, well, we left out this group, or there's a lot of people didn't respond, or there's some reason that people might not give us accurate information. And you should have a little more experience with that now that you've done your own surveys for the project. Next, we did experiments versus observational studies, and we talked about these as we've gone through some of the studies in the recent days, right, the past weeks. Experiments, we give people a treatment. Observational studies, we do not. Experiments are great because we can actually make sure that we're controlling for confounding variables. We actually have the ability to say this caused that. Whereas with observational studies, such as like the CT program, we can say, yes, students who attend the CT sessions are more likely to pass, but we can't say that the actual CT program is the reason, because those students who attend are different than the students who don't attend. So definitely an important topic. Within experiments and observational studies, we had our types of observational studies. I don't imagine I'll get much into this. This is one of those things you could probably ignore. We did cross-sectional, perspective, retrospective. We had our types of experiments. And that was our completely randomized, our block, and our matched pair. The only one of these things that really matters now is this idea of our, I keep bringing that up, our matched pair. Because once we got into part 8, we had that idea of paired data versus independent samples and those two different methods. So paired data, definitely an important idea from part 1 that's still going to come up in our later things, and so possibly something you would see on the tests. And then we had a bunch of experimental lingo. And so examples of our experimental lingo, this was like our response variable, explanatory variables. And all of this stuff is still really fair game, especially these two ideas, because our X and our Y, what it is that we're trying to look at in terms of a relationship, very important. And that was the only other thing we had was confounding versus lurking in part 1. And to me, this confounding versus lurking falls kind of into the like observational study stuff. Like, it's great. Even like the bias stuff, it's good, but I would probably more ask you a general short answer question. Here's something someone did. What's a potential problem? What's a potential confounding or lurking variable that they didn't consider? So both of these to me are going to become more critical thinking and less about the actual definitions. I just want to see that you guys have accomplished what I set out to do, which is I made you all cynics. And then we might as well just throw a definition that I put in part 2, but it could have easily been in part 1 here, which could also be on the test, which is categorical versus quantitative. And by itself, it's a really boring question, so I'll probably ask, like, which display should I be using? So I'm pulling in all the graphic stuff from part 2 with identifying what type of variable it is. And to me, again, that's still critical thinking. So those two, and then the ones that you want to pay the most attention to here, probably going back to experimental lingo, sampling methods, statistic and parameter, telling experiments and observational studies apart, and then of course that match pair idea, the paired versus independent samples that we saw in part 8. So that's part 1. I'll make a new video for part 2.